If I had said yes to that stranger outside the corner store, I don't think I'd be alive today, and I still don't know how he knew everything about me. I was 19 years old when I first came to the United States. My father died before I could even remember him, and my mother passed away from cancer just days before my 18th birthday. I stayed with my sister for a while. She was married with kids by then, but I knew I couldn't stay forever. I wanted a different life. I wanted out of Guatemala. With help from an old friend of my father's, I managed to get a sponsor and a job in Texas. About a year and a half later, I arrived in Laredo. America felt huge, loud, full of possibility. The work was exhausting and the pay barely enough, but I was grateful. My grandmother used to say, when there's no bread, you eat tortillas. And that's what I was doing, making do. I worked long hours, slept in a cramped shared apartment, and told myself things would get better. Then the fire happened. We woke up to someone pounding on doors, screaming for everyone to get out. Half the building was already in flames. I'm pretty sure people died that night. I lost my room, my things, everything. After that, I lived out of my car. I worked late nights at a small cantina, pressing tortillas, saving every dollar I could toward a future I hadn't even figured out yet. Laredo was full of desperate people back then. Crime was rising, and more than once I was offered ways to make easy money. Most of the offers were almost funny. I couldn't imagine myself selling drugs or running girls. I was skinny, tired, and clearly not built for that life. But not every offer made me laugh. One night during my break, I walked to a corner store for a soda and cigarettes. Instead of heading straight back, I leaned against the wall outside, smoking and thinking. That's when I heard a voice behind me say in Spanish, "You work too hard, son." I turned and saw a man walking toward me. He looked like a cowboy, but not the poor kind. Clean boots, expensive hat, big polished belt buckle, the kind of guy who clearly had money. I said something polite, figuring he'd move on. He didn't. He stepped closer and said something that made my stomach tighten, a saying only people from Guatemala use, a phrase about how things used to be better back home. The problem was, his accent was Mexican. I asked him how he knew where I was from. He just smiled and said he'd been all over. Then he told me it was his job to know things about people, and that his job paid very well. All I'd have to do, he said, was give something up. I knew that voice. I knew that tone. It was the sound of trouble pretending to be opportunity. And before I could even tell him no, he leaned closer and explained exactly what he wanted from me, and why walking away wouldn't be as easy as I thought. He told me straight up that what he was offering was illegal, but in his words, not immoral. He said I wouldn't be moving drugs. I wouldn't be hurting women. I wouldn't be doing anything that could get me deported. He promised I wouldn't even have to work for 6 to 8 weeks afterward. My food and housing would be covered. And when it was over, I'd walk away with $4,000 in cash. $4,000. That was more than half my yearly pay at the time. Way more than any dealer or pimp had ever waved in my face. And when he repeated that no one would be harmed, I'll admit, it caught my attention. He said the real money outside the law came from avoiding vice. No drugs, no prostitution. He told me the trick was working with wealthy Americans, not against them. According to him, rich people always needed solutions. At first, I assumed it was some kind of financial scam, white-collar crime, something quiet. He kept things vague on purpose. I see that now. Curiosity is a hook, and he knew exactly how to use it. Eventually, I asked him what I actually had to do to earn that kind of money. Instead of answering, he started asking me questions. Was I healthy? Any heart issues? Diabetes? Medication? Medical questions? The kind that don't make sense until they suddenly do. I thought maybe whatever the job was, it required strength, endurance. I was wrong. He wasn't offering me $4,000 for my time. He was offering it for one of my kidneys. When he said it, my brain refused to accept the words. I thought maybe I misunderstood. Maybe it was slang. Maybe something got lost in translation. He mistook my silence for shock and launched into what sounded like a practiced speech. He told me a young man could live just fine with one kidney. He even claimed that with enough time it could grow back. I was young, I was broke, but I wasn't stupid. Organs don't grow back. I wanted to tell him to go to hell. But something deep in my gut told me that insulting a man like that wasn't smart. So I told him I'd think about it. He handed me a business card with only a phone number written on it. I never called. I never told anyone either. Where I come from, people talk themselves into graves just as often as they're paid to dig them. Silence felt safer. I told myself that real progress takes time, that shortcuts come with prices you don't see until it's too late. I've never met anyone who admitted to selling an organ, but if men like him feel comfortable asking strangers on the street, then someone out there must be saying yes. And that's the part that still scares me, because if you're desperate enough to sell a piece of yourself, what's stopping them from taking more? I was strong enough to walk away, but I know for a fact that not everyone is. There are nights from that jail I still wake up sweating, and one of them nearly ended with me bleeding out on the concrete. I worked as a correctional officer for just over 2 years, not because that was the plan, but because that was all I could survive. After that, no amount of money would have convinced me to walk back through those doors. The county jail I worked at wasn't even considered one of the worst in California. There are places far more dangerous, but anyone who's worked nights behind bars knows how fast a normal shift can turn into something out of a nightmare. Inmates threw everything you can imagine: urine, feces, food trays, at staff and other inmates. Sex happened constantly. Fights broke out over nothing. Most of the crazy stuff people see on TV, it's either real or toned down from reality. After a while, the everyday insanity fades into the background. It becomes routine. Only the truly disturbing things stick with you. Like the night I caught an inmate trying to light her own clothes on fire with a lighter she'd smuggled in a place I won't describe. When I confiscated it, she cried, not because she'd almost burned herself, but because I took the lighter away. Or the time I found a woman hanging from a bedsheet, her skin already turning blue. I thought she was dead. Another officer rushed in and started CPR. Somehow, she came back, coughing, gasping, then sitting up like nothing had happened. A few minutes later, she was thanking us. People don't always want to die. Sometimes they just want the pain to stop, and when they realize how close they came, it hits them all at once. Then there were the liars. One inmate claimed she was having a heart attack. None of us believed her. She'd pulled the same stunt before, faking medical emergencies to attack staff or try to escape. That night, we thought it was just another manipulation. We were wrong, because when we finally opened her cell door, she proved exactly how dangerous one bad assumption can be. After shift change, a newer male officer was assigned to her wing. He hadn't dealt with her before, and after listening to her for a few minutes, he started doubting that she was faking. That mistake almost ruined his life. He opened her cell door and knelt down to check on her. Before he could even react, she lunged forward, grabbed him by the collar, yanked him down, and bit into his face. Hard. By the time the response team arrived, the damage was done. He was missing a chunk of his cheek. I later heard she took a brutal beating before officers finally got control of her. She was charged with aggravated assault on staff. The officer needed over a dozen staples, and he never came back to the job. Then there was another inmate, bigger, stronger, meaner. She decided she wanted to die and tried to jump from the second tier. A nearby officer grabbed her in time. Instead of trying to break free, the inmate decided she wasn't going alone. She wrapped herself around the officer and leaned forward, trying to pull them both over the railing. For a few seconds, they were balanced on the edge. Another guard rushed in and dragged them back just in time. From what I heard, it was very close. Both of them could have been dead. That inmate was always a problem. She knew how big she was and used it, but jail has a way of humbling people. One smaller inmate once told her, "They make coffins in your size too." She didn't like that. Not long after, she was stabbed in the back of the head by another inmate. The shank pierced her skull. She survived, but with brain damage. Months of rehab, trouble walking, trouble speaking. But none of that is what finally made me quit. What broke me wasn't the inmates, it was my coworkers. There was one female officer everyone dreaded working with. Lazy, careless, always cutting corners. The word was she'd be fired the next time she messed up. When it finally happened, it was worse than anyone expected. She skipped multiple required walkarounds. When she finally checked, she found a male inmate hanging in his cell. Unlike the woman I helped save earlier, this man was gone. They said he'd been dead for hours. We were supposed to check cells every 30 minutes. We all thought the jail would throw her under the bus. They didn't. Instead, it was covered up. Reports were quietly adjusted, timelines blurred. She was allowed to resign instead of being fired, no charges, no public fallout. That was it for me. I could handle violent inmates. I could handle chaos. But I couldn't work in a place where the system itself was more dangerous than the people locked inside. Because the scariest thing about that jail wasn't the inmates. It was knowing the people meant to protect life were willing to look the other way. If I'd been standing 10 feet closer that night, I wouldn't be here, and the sound I heard still plays in my head. I've worked construction most of my adult life, bouncing between different firms. For a while, I was a site supervisor for a small but extremely successful local company here in the Midwest. The work was brutal, and the owner could be a real nightmare, but the pay made it worth it. We took jobs no one else wanted, dangerous, rushed, complicated builds, and because of that, we could charge whatever we wanted. The downside was stability. When there wasn't a contract, there was no work. That changed when the county called. A large housing development was supposed to go up between our town and the next city over. A national construction company had been hired, but they backed out after a scheduling disaster. The problem was, the old housing complex had already been demolished. If the new buildings weren't finished before fall, hundreds of people would be without homes. That's when our company stepped in. According to our boss, we could finish the job early and under budget by running day and night crews. Half the team worked days, half worked nights, rotating weekly. Foundations and brickwork first, then another company would handle interiors later. On paper, it was perfect. In reality, night shifts wrecked us. Anyone who's worked nights knows the rest of life doesn't stop. Kids still need rides. Appointments still happen. Sleep becomes a luxury. By the end of each night cycle, guys were barely functioning. Still, we pushed through. No one wanted to miss the deadline and lose the contract. People joked about accidents happening, but we stayed sharp. No shortcuts, no risks. At least that was the plan. Then the crane arrived. A massive mobile crane, over 500 tons, brand new, leased for night operations. It was operated by a veteran crane operator and a young apprentice. Late one night, while the crane was moving heavy steel panels, the apprentice decided to get ahead on a task. He stepped away to clean part of the deck early, thinking he was well out of the way. He wasn't. He thought he was clear of the crane's swing zone, but he was standing exactly where he shouldn't have been. And by the time anyone realized what was about to happen, there was no time to shout, no time to run, and no way to stop what came next. Then someone on the precast crew called for a crate of steel plates from the other side of the site. The crane operator swung the boom the opposite direction, and that was it. At first, all I heard was screaming, not normal yelling, panic. The kind of shouting that makes your stomach drop before your brain catches up. I ran toward the noise. The apprentice was pinned between the crane's massive counterweights and the deck he'd been cleaning. There was nothing anyone could do. When the operator pulled the weights back, what was left of him came apart. I won't describe it. I don't need to. It was the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. The kind of image that never fades, no matter how hard you try to forget it. After that, I became ruthless about safety. I'm the guy everyone hates on site, The one barking orders, double-checking zones, stopping work over small things. Some of the younger guys think I'm an asshole. I don't care. I'd rather be hated and send people home alive than be liked and attend their funerals. The fallout was ugly. The apprentice's family tried to sue the company, hoping for answers, maybe closure. But the firm proved he'd stepped into a restricted area he'd been trained to avoid. He'd signed the safety forms. He knew the rules. Legally, there was nothing they could do. I don't even think the family wanted money. They just needed someone to blame. When you lose someone like that, accepting it was a mistake feels impossible, especially so soon. The owner didn't sleep much after that. He kept asking himself if he could have prevented it. More training, stricter standards, anything. The guys who saw the accident up close were never the same. Neither was I. Some nights I still hear the shouting. And that's why, whenever someone tells me safety rules are overkill, I know exactly what happens when you ignore them, because I've seen the cost. I held his hand while he drowned in his own blood, and I still don't know why that night haunts me more than the others. I used to work as a hospice nurse, mostly night shifts, for almost 3 years. I've seen a lot of death. Most of it was expected. Some of it was peaceful, and some of it was absolutely horrifying. One night, I was caring for a man with advanced lung cancer. A tumor had grown so large that it eventually ruptured a blood vessel in his lungs. I had tucked him into bed myself and stepped out of the room for maybe 5 minutes. That's when I heard his wife scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It was raw, animal, like something inside her had snapped. I ran back into the room just as something wet hit the floor. Blood was pouring out of his mouth, far more than seemed possible. I immediately guided his wife out of the room, telling her I needed to clean him up. The truth was, I knew he didn't have long, maybe minutes. I took his hand and told him everything would be okay, that it would be over soon. He tried to speak, but all that came out were weak, choking sounds. His eyes were wide with panic. He was begging me to help him breathe. There was nothing I could do. Unless someone is already on an operating table, there's no fixing something like that. All you can do is stay with them and make sure they're not alone when it ends. He went into shock within minutes. He died less than 10 minutes later. The floor around his bed was dark red and sticky from the blood. It took 2 hot wash cycles to get the stains out of my uniform. That wasn't the only time I saw something like that. Another patient suffered a rupture of severe esophageal varices, basically swollen blood vessels in the throat caused by liver failure. When they burst, the bleeding is sudden and violent. There are medications that help a little, but it's a condition that only gets worse. The simplest way to explain it is this. Your body becomes filled with ticking time bombs, and eventually one of them explodes. I also cared for a 32-year-old man with advanced liver failure from alcoholism. He tried rehab. At one point, he was even considered for a liver transplant, but there's a limit. If someone is too sick to survive the surgery, doctors won't perform it. He drank himself out of eligibility. He was admitted because his abdomen had filled with liters of fluid, and toxins in his body were starting to shut down his heart and lungs. At just 32 years old, he chose to be DNR, do not resuscitate. We thought that was the end. Somehow he improved, enough to walk slowly around the ward. He was discharged, promising to turn his life around. A few weeks later, he came back to the ER. This time, he couldn't stop vomiting. And what happened next is the moment that finally broke something in me, because it proved that sometimes surviving once only makes the ending worse. He'd relapsed. He went on a binge, and this time it destroyed what little his body had left. Not long after he arrived back on our unit, the anti-nausea meds stopped working. What he was throwing up changed, first bile, then thick, dark blood, and then more blood, so much that it didn't seem possible for a human body to produce it that fast. It was violent, painful, chaotic. We flooded him with transfusions, hoping, praying that the bleeding would slow, that the ruptured vessels would finally clamp down. They didn't. Despite everything we did, he began slipping away. His eyes rolled back. His breathing slowed, each inhale farther apart than the last. His heart rhythm went from unstable to dangerous, ventricular tachycardia, the kind that usually sends people sprinting for a defibrillator. But we couldn't. He'd made his choice weeks earlier, DNR. So instead of jumping in, we had to stand back and watch his heart unravel. The monitor told the story before his body did. Fast spikes turned erratic turned slow, slow turned wrong. The blips grew farther apart, weaker, like a signal fading into static. His breathing stopped completely. I've been present for plenty of deaths where the room fills with frustration, where staff feel like they lost a fight, where someone was almost saved. This wasn't like that. What filled the room that night wasn't anger or failure. It was relief. A heavy, quiet relief, because the suffering was finally over. That moment still stays with me. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was so devastatingly unnecessary. Addiction took a young man who had chances, help, and people rooting for him, and dragged him to one of the most miserable, preventable deaths I've ever witnessed. That night taught me something I'll never forget. Surviving once doesn't mean you're safe. Sometimes it just means the ending will hurt more. If this story shook you, even a little, do me a favor. Backhand index pointing right, share it. Backhand index pointing right, talk about it. Backhand index pointing right, and if you or someone you love is struggling, don't wait until relief is the only ending left. And if you want to hear more real stories like this, raw, honest, and unfiltered, follow, turn on notifications, and stay with us. Because some stories aren't meant to scare you.